I was cooking soup when my daughter-in-law suddenly slapped the ladle straight against my head. "Who even cooks like this, you useless old woman?" Tasha Benton's voice sliced through the thick air of the kitchen, sharp as a blade. I felt the scorching metal press into my temple, boiling soup spilling over my hair and running down my cheek. A burning sting spread across my scalp, but it still wasn't as painful as something else. From the living room, the TV suddenly blasted at full volume. Jalen, my son, was sitting there. He heard everything, and instead of stepping in, he simply turned the TV up louder, as if his own mother's cries were just background noise he needed to drown out. I stood wobbling by the stove, one hand gripping the counter to keep myself from collapsing, feeling hot blood trickle from my temple down my neck. Tasha looked at me with contempt, still holding the ladle dripping with soup, her mouth running nonstop. "Look at you. Pathetic. I don't even know why Jalen brought you here. You're nothing but a burden, a useless woman taking up space in someone else's home." Every word felt like a slap. I wanted to respond, just one sentence, but my throat locked up. My whole body trembled, unsure if it was from pain, humiliation, or anger. Then 5 minutes later, a loud crash shook the entire house, pots rolling, dishes shattering. And I, Lorraine McRae, 71 years old, collapsed among the fragments of my own dignity. Jalen rushed over and froze at the kitchen doorway. He stared at me lying in the chaos, blood still sliding down my forehead. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Not, "Are you okay?" but "What are you doing?" But what neither Jalen nor Tasha knew was that in that very moment, I still had one final card left to play. A card Harold, my late husband, had quietly prepared for more than 30 years, and when the time came, it would change everything. What do you think could make a mother endure to her very breaking point yet stay silent? Come with me. Let's go back to the days before everything collapsed, to understand why it all began with a bowl of soup that seemed so harmless. My name is Lorraine McRae, 71 years old. My hands are calloused from decades of kneading dough, cooking meals for others. And my heart, once blindly believed in the loyalty of family, I was foolish. I was blind. 6 months ago, I buried Harold, the man who had been my husband through 50 years of marriage. One April afternoon, his heart stopped without warning. Right in the middle of watering the geraniums in our backyard, I found him there, kneeling on the ground, the hose still running, cool water soaking the brown shoes he loved so much. But to tell the story of Harold's death, I must tell you about the life we had before that. We met in 1974, in a small cafe near Grady Memorial Hospital. That day, I had just finished a night shift as a nurse, exhausted, while Harold stopped by for a cup of coffee before heading to a construction site. He was sitting at the next table. When he dropped his newspaper, I bent down to pick it up for him. When I looked up, our eyes met. "Thank you," he said, his voice warm like a morning cup of coffee. "Don't mention it," I replied with a smile. A week later, he showed up again. This time he carried 2 cups of coffee. "I don't know how you like yours, so I just guessed," he said, a bit shy. The coffee was slightly bitter, but it was a sweetness I would never forget. We married after 8 months of dating, a small, simple wedding with only family and a few close friends. No extravagance. Just sincerity. Harold slid a simple gold ring onto my finger and said, "You'll never have to worry. I'll take care of you." And he kept that promise. For 50 years, though only later did I understand what that truly meant. Harold worked tirelessly. He woke at 5 in the morning and returned home long after sunset. On weekends, he still took on small projects. Once I asked him, "You work so much and earn quite a bit. Why do we still live so modestly?" He only smiled and kissed my forehead. "Saving for the future, Lorraine, for when we grow old." I believed him. I didn't ask further. That was my mistake. Not because Harold deceived me, but because he wanted me to feel secure, wanted to shield me from financial burdens. He thought that was love. But sometimes love is also a kind of concealment. We had Jalen in 1978, a little boy with his father's eyes and my smile. I left my nursing job to raise him at home. Harold said, "You stay home, I'll handle everything outside." And I accepted it, believing that was how a family should function. The years raising Jalen were the most beautiful of my life. I remember him at 4 years old, running out to wrap his arms around my legs every time I came back from the market. I remember the first time he said, "I love you, Mom," in that tiny, sweet voice. I remember the nights Harold and I sat on the porch watching Jalen chase fireflies, thinking silently, this is happiness. Sometimes, when Harold slept deeply, I would lie beside him and look at his face in the dark. The wrinkles at his eyes, the sun-darkened patches on his forehead, all signs of a man carrying the weight of the world for his family. I used to want to ask about the envelopes he locked in the wooden drawer or those sudden monthly trips to the bank. But then I'd tell myself, I don't need to know as long as he's safe. Looking back, perhaps that was the first time I learned to stay silent, and the first time I lost the right to know the truth. This April, a Tuesday at 4 p.m, I was in the kitchen baking apple pie, Harold's favorite. The sound of running water outside went on longer than usual. Strange. Harold never forgot to turn off the hose. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped outside. And I saw him, kneeling in the geranium bed, head slumped forward, his right hand still holding the hose. Water pouring endlessly, soaking the khaki pants he had put on that morning. "Harold?" My voice trembled. No answer. "Harold!" I screamed, running to him, dropping to my knees beside him. I lifted his face. His eyes were shut, his lips pale. I screamed, though I don't remember what I said. Neighbors rushed over. Someone called 911. The ambulance arrived. They took him away. But I knew. From the moment I saw him lying in the garden, I knew. Harold was gone. At the hospital, the doctor said gently, "Acute heart attack." He passed before we arrived. I sat in the waiting room at Grady Memorial, covered in flour, shoes stained with garden dirt. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because my body no longer knew how to react. An hour later, Jalen arrived. He hugged me, murmuring, "Mom, I'm sorry." But I could feel it. The hug was shallow, obligatory. Not from the heart, I returned to the empty house on Auburn Avenue, where we had lived for 45 years. Every corner carried Harold's imprint. The recliner where he read the newspaper, the coffee mug he left on the table, the scent of aftershave still lingering in the bathroom. I didn't clean anything. I left it all as it was, as if he had only gone on a short trip and would soon return. But he wasn't coming back. Those first nights, I lay in bed, reaching toward the left side, the spot where Harold once slept, and touched nothing but cold emptiness. I cried, but quietly, so no one would hear. Though, there was no one to hear anyway. Loneliness isn't when no one is around you. Loneliness is when the one person who understood you is gone. A week after the funeral, Jalen called, "Mom, you can't live alone. At your age, it's dangerous. Come stay with Tasha and me." His voice sounded worried. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. "Are you sure? Tasha won't mind?" "No, Mom. Tasha agrees. We want to take care of you." I believed him because I needed a reason to keep going, because I couldn't endure the silence of that house another day. So I packed my life into 4 suitcases, left the home where I raised my child, where Harold and I danced in the kitchen every Sunday, where every brick, every corner held our memories. I closed the door for the last time, locked it, turned away, and stepped into a completely new chapter of my life, the worst one. Jalen's house was in Sweet Auburn, in a newly developed modern neighborhood. Polished wooden floors, interiors that looked like they came straight out of a design magazine. Tasha Benton greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Hello, Mrs. Lorraine," she said. Not Mom, not Mama, just Mrs. Lorraine, as if I were a stranger. From the very first day, I knew I had made a mistake. But by then, it was too late to go back. They gave me a small room at the end of the hallway. Its window faced a narrow, dark alley that never saw sunlight. Only darkness and the sound of traffic drifting up from the street below. I hung Harold's picture on the wall, folded my few gray dresses into the closet, and tried my best to make myself invisible. That was my new role in this house, to exist without causing inconvenience. But even when I tried to vanish, I was still a thorn in their eyes. I woke up early, made coffee, cooked breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, freshly squeezed orange juice. Jalen came down first, always in a rush, eyes glued to his phone. "Thanks, Mom," he mumbled without ever looking up. Tasha appeared after him in a green silk robe, hair perfectly done even at dawn. She sat at the table, scanning every detail, and then began to judge the coffee's too weak. The eggs are too salty. There was never a word of thanks, never a hint of appreciation. I only nodded, smiled, and tried again. The next day I wanted to be useful. I wanted to be needed. I wanted to believe I still had a place in my son's life. I cooked, I did laundry, I cleaned. I became a silent shadow moving along the hallway, picking up crumbs, folding towels, wiping corners no one ever looked at. Tasha worked from home, meetings, calls, deadlines. Whenever something in her day went wrong, I became the most convenient outlet for her anger. "Why did you leave this here?" she snapped, pointing at a cup I'd forgotten on the side table. "You can't do anything right, can you?" Jalen was there. He heard everything, but he said nothing. He just looked away, as if it had nothing to do with him, as if I wasn't his mother. Sometimes, in the afternoon, I sat alone on the bench in the kitchen, gazing out of the small window. Sunlight slanted through the wooden fence, scattering tiny golden patches across the floor. I closed my eyes and imagined I was back in the old kitchen on Auburn Avenue, where Harold would hum softly while baking. I missed the smell of apple pie, the radio playing soul music from the 70s, Jalen's bright laughter when he was little in his Superman t-shirt. Those memories were as gentle as a breeze, but when I opened my eyes, all that remained was the smell of cold coffee and the clacking of Tasha's keyboard. In that moment, I realized, in this house, there was no room for memories, no room for anything that had ever been warm, and perhaps no room for me either. Many nights, I lay awake, listening to the ticking of the clock. I wondered where I had gone wrong, where I had failed as a mother, why my son could allow me to be treated this way. Tears fell silently. I wiped them dry before dawn. I couldn't let them see me weak. I couldn't give them a reason to throw me out. But abuse never happens all at once. It starts with small things, worn down bit by bit, until you no longer recognize yourself. In the second week, I accidentally tossed a white towel into a load of colored laundry. One of Tasha's shirts came out tinged with pale pink. She screamed in my face for 20 straight minutes. "You've ruined my clothes. Do you have any idea how much this costs? Do you know how hard I worked to buy this?" I apologized. I offered to buy a new one, but she didn't listen. She just needed someone to take it out on. In the 5th week, I was vacuuming and accidentally knocked over a decorative vase. It shattered across the wooden floor. My heart stopped. Tasha rushed out, her face flushed with rage. "That was a wedding gift! Irreplaceable! You really are stupid and clumsy, aren't you?" I knelt down to pick up each shard, my hands getting cut and bleeding, yet I remained silent. Jalen walked past, saw me on my knees on the floor, then quietly kept going. In the 8th week, I cooked chicken stew. Tasha took one bite and spat it out. "Disgusting! Do you even know how to season food? Or are you trying to poison us?" She threw the entire plate into the trash right in front of me. Jalen sat there calmly, placing his food delivery order on the table, without saying a word. In the 10th week, I made the mistake of asking Tasha a question while she was in an online meeting. She muted her microphone, turned to me with eyes cold as blades. "Get out! Don't bother me when I'm working. You don't have anything important to do, but I do, understood?" I just nodded and backed away, feeling myself shrink. So small it was like I might disappear. I started to wonder, do I even deserve to live? Would they breathe easier if I were gone? I looked in the mirror and saw a thin woman, hair graying in patches, eyes sunken deep. "Harold," I whispered to his photo on the nightstand, "if you could see our son treating me like this, what would you do?" But Harold couldn't answer. He was gone, and I had to endure this. Alone, I decided to make vegetable soup, the dish Jalen had loved most as a child. Whenever he was sick, I cooked it for him, and he would always say, "Mom makes the best soup in the world." I thought, maybe if I cooked it again, Jalen would remember. Maybe he would look at me and see his mother, not a burden. I carefully chopped carrots, sliced onions, added celery, potatoes, tomatoes I seasoned, tasted and tasted again, wanting to make sure everything was perfect. But then Tasha stormed into the kitchen like a hurricane. "What are you doing?" Her voice sharp as a knife. "Soup for dinner," I replied softly, not turning around. "Jalen's favorite." She stepped closer, looked into the pot, and frowned in disgust. "It looks like pig slop. How much salt did you put in here? Are you trying to kill us?" Every word she spoke felt like a blade cutting into my chest. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. She grabbed the ladle in the pot, and before I could react, she brought it down hard on my head. The blow left me dizzy. I felt the heat of the metal, boiling soup spilling onto my hair, scorching my temple. "Who even cooks like this, you useless old woman?" Tasha's voice rang out, harsh and shrill. I staggered, clinging to the edge of the counter to keep from falling. From the living room, the TV blared, louder than before. Jalen was there. He heard it, and he turned the volume up. It wasn't the blow that broke me. It wasn't the insults that hurt the most. It was that sound, the TV roaring louder, trying to drown out his mother's choked sobs. The son I once cradled in my arms, stayed up all night with when he had a fever, worked 2 jobs to pay his tuition for, now chose silence, chose a television show over his mother's pain. And in that very moment, something inside me, something that had been straining to endure for months, suddenly snapped. I stood there, leaning against the counter. The ladle was still dripping soup onto the floor. Tasha Benton looked at me with disgust, waiting for me to apologize, waiting for me to kneel, to beg for forgiveness simply for the crime of existing. But all I could hear in my head was one sound, the television in the living room being turned up. I thought about Jalen, about how the volume rose the exact moment Tasha screamed into my face, about how he knew precisely what was happening, yet chose not to see it. "You're pathetic," Tasha spat, arms crossed. "Look at this mess. You can't even make a pot of soup properly. I don't understand why Jalen brought you here. You're a burden, a useless woman taking up space." Every word was a slap. I wanted to answer back, to defend myself, but my voice was trapped somewhere deep in my throat. I bent down, trying to wipe the splatters of soup on the floor, my hands trembling. My temples still throbbed where the ladle had struck. Tasha stomped out of the kitchen, and I stood there alone, amid steam and silence. 5 minutes. That's all it took for me to make a decision. I looked at the row of pots on the stove, at the stack of plates on the rack. At the kitchen I had scrubbed clean every day for months, hoping to earn a place in a house that was never mine. And something inside me exploded. No planning, no calculation, just survival instinct. I grabbed the biggest pot, the same pot of soup she had mocked, and dumped it entirely into the sink. The hot liquid roared down the drain with a violent hiss. Then I picked up another pot, and another. I let them fall. One crashed onto the floor, one slammed against the counter. Plates slipped from my hands, Cups shattered, forks and knives clattered everywhere, a storm of chaos, a release, a necessary eruption. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. Jalen's, "What's going on?" he barked. He reached the kitchen doorway and froze. His face drained as he saw me standing among spilled soup, toppled pots, shattered dishes, a line of blood trailing from my temple. "Mom, what are you doing?" he whispered. But he didn't step in, didn't touch me, just stared at me as though all of this was my fault. Tasha appeared behind him. The shock in her eyes quickly twisted into fury. "She's insane! Your mother has completely lost it!" she screamed, pointing at me like I was some dangerous creature. "Look at this disaster. She's destroyed my kitchen. Call someone, Jalen. This woman needs to be locked up." Jalen looked at me. I looked back, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to defend me, or at least ask why I did it. But he only shook his head, shame and disappointment swirling in his eyes. "Mom, why? Why would you do this?" "Why?" I echoed, my voice raw and broken. "Your wife just slammed a boiling ladle onto my head. Jalen, she hit me, and you turned the TV up." Those words were blades. He blinked, confused or pretending to be, I didn't hear anything, Mom. I didn't know." "Liar." The word hung between us like toxic smoke. "You were right there. You heard everything and you chose to do nothing." Tasha shoved herself between us, face flushed. "I'm done. I'm not living with this ungrateful old woman. Someone who disrespects everyone, Jalen. Choose. Either she goes or I go." The kitchen fell eerily silent. Only the sound of dripping soup from the bent ladle, the crunch of broken glass underfoot, and a faint, burnt smell lingered in the air. In that moment, I saw again the image of 4-year-old Jalen holding a bowl of soup with both hands, looking up with a smile. Mom makes the best in the world. That memory flickered out, replaced by the man standing before me, avoiding my eyes. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. I looked at my son, pleading with my eyes. "Remember who raised you, who stayed up all night when you were sick, who worked 2 jobs to pay for your college tuition." Jalen lowered his head, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had already surrendered. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally murmured, "but I think it's better if you find somewhere else. This isn't working. You're causing problems. You need to go." The world stopped. My heart stopped. Everything stopped. "You're sending me away?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Your wife hit me and you're sending me away?" "It's not like that, Mom. It's just Tasha and I need our own space, and you need independence. It'll be better for everyone." He spoke with pre-packaged phrases, empty, lifeless, as if someone had shoved them into his mouth. My son was gone. Only a stranger wearing his face remained. "When?" I asked, feeling the burn behind my eyes. "Tomorrow morning. I'll call a taxi. You can stay at a hotel while you look for long-term housing. I'll help you with expenses." In that moment, I realized they were firing me like an employee, and worst of all, Jalen couldn't even meet my eyes while doing it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Harold's photos, wondering what he would say if he saw me now. I packed my things slowly, folding each item neatly, as if a bit of order on the outside could hold together what was collapsing inside. At the first hint of dawn, a taxi horn sounded outside the door. Jalen stood there, holding $200. "Just so you can get settled," he said, avoiding my eyes. I didn't hug him. I didn't say goodbye. I just took the money, pulled my suitcases along, and walked out of that house without looking back. The driver asked where I wanted to go. I didn't have an answer. "Any cheap motel will do," I finally whispered. He drove me out to a suburb of Atlanta, where flickering neon signs cast light over peeling walls, a cheap motel with damp carpet and the smell of bleach mixed with old cigarette smoke. The room cost $30 a night. I did the math in my head. With $200, I could survive not even a week. The room was small, its beige walls stained, the bed creaking every time I moved. The window looked out onto a parking lot where cars came and went all night. The neon lights blinked in steady pulses, washing everything in a sickly, pale red glow. I sat on the bed, and for the first time in many months, I broke down. Not the quiet tears I had been swallowing, but harsh, heaving sobs pulled from somewhere deep in my chest, the sound of 50 years being squeezed out of me. I cried for Harold, who was gone, leaving me in a world I no longer recognized. I cried for Jalen, the boy who once clung to me and called me his hero. And I cried for myself, the woman who once knew exactly who she was, and now wasn't sure of anything anymore. When the tears dried, only emptiness remained. I looked at myself in the mirror under the cold fluorescent light. A 71-year-old woman stared back. Deep wrinkles, swollen eyes, gray hair in disarray. A bruise still marked my temple where the ladle had struck. I touched it gently, feeling how the physical pain had become a strange kind of salvation, because at least it had a shape, a boundary. I barely left the room. I watched TV without understanding what was on. I ate so little it was just enough to stay alive. I went out only to buy snacks and instant coffee from the vending machine. Once, the machine swallowed my last $2 and gave me nothing back. I stood there watching the money disappear and realized it was the perfect metaphor for my life. At first, I tried to hold on to some shred of dignity. "Son, I need to talk to you." No reply. Then I texted more bluntly, "Jalen, I'm running out of money." Silence. Then I stopped texting. The messages showed read, but there was never a response, like screaming into a black hole. The motel manager, a heavy-set man, knocked on my door. "Ma'am, I need you to either pay or vacate the room." His voice wasn't cold, just tired. I begged for one more day. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Rules are rules." I packed my suitcases again. Those 4 suitcases now felt as heavy as stone. I dragged them into the parking lot beneath the burning sun. I had no idea where I was going. I walked for hours. My feet burned, my hands blistered, but I kept walking because stopping meant admitting I had nowhere left to go. Among the rushing crowds, I saw a young mother crossing the street holding her child's hand. The child laughed, pointing at an ice cream shop across the road, and I could only stop and watch them as though through a glass pane separating me from another lifetime. I used to be that woman, the one with a family, with purpose, with a home to return to. Now it was just me and my suitcases full of memories. I found a small park near downtown Atlanta. There were a few metal benches, some children on the swings, and people who avoided looking at me as they walked past. A woman pulled her daughter along faster when the little girl stared at me, as if poverty were a contagious disease. At night, I sat hunched over, clutching my purse, eyes tracking every small movement in the dark. A homeless man came over and handed me a piece of bread. "Here, eat. You gotta be careful out here," he said. I accepted it with trembling hands. He nodded and walked away. I started looking for food in the dumpsters behind restaurants. At first I felt disgusted, ashamed, but hunger is stronger than pride. I found stale bread, bruised fruit, leftovers someone had thrown away. I ate in the shadows of alleyways, where no one could see me. There was a church a few miles away that served free soup every Tuesday and Thursday. I stood in line with dozens of faces blurred by hunger and exhaustion. A young volunteer handed me a bowl of soup and smiled. "God bless you, ma'am." I nodded, unable to speak. Nights were the enemy, cold, long, and full of fear. I lay on a bench, covering myself with a sweater, listening to car horns, shouting, and laughter spilling out from distant bars. I thought of Jalen, sleeping in a soft bed in a heated house. Did he ever think of his mother? One morning, a police officer woke me up. "You can't sleep here, ma'am. You need to move along." I told him I had nowhere to go. He sighed. "There's a shelter about 6 miles from here." Try there." I went. The shelter was full. "Come back tomorrow," they said. It was always tomorrow, never today. I lost my sense of time. Days blurred together into a gray haze of exhaustion and despair. My clothes were filthy, my hair tangled, my skin cracked. I became one of the invisible people others avoided, a wandering shadow. But then, in the middle of all that ruin, something strange happened. I started remembering myself. I remembered that before I married Harold, I once wanted to study literature. I once won a poetry contest at school. I once had dreams of my own, before I became a wife, a mother, and then no one at all. One afternoon, while digging through my suitcase for a clean shirt, I found an old yellowed envelope. My name, Lorraine McRae, was written on it in Harold's familiar handwriting. My heart clenched. I opened it with shaking hands. "My dearest Lorraine, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything while I was alive. I only wanted to shield you from worry, but I now realize that keeping you in the dark was a mistake." My vision blurred. Harold's voice seemed to rise up from between the lines. "For the past 30 years, I've been investing. Small at first, then larger. I bought properties when no one wanted them. In places that later increased in value, I saved every cent, preparing for our future. I didn't tell you because I wanted one day to surprise you, so that our old age would be lived in peace." I opened the attached documents, deeds, investment certificates, bank records. My eyes ran over the numbers, unable to believe them. 13 properties, all in my name. Among them was an address so painfully familiar it knocked the breath out of me. Auburn Avenue, NE, Sweet Auburn, Atlanta. The building where Jalen and Tasha lived. The place where I had been humiliated, hit, and thrown out. Belonged to me. It had been mine from the beginning. I sat frozen in the park, surrounded by my suitcases, holding proof that I was not the destitute woman the world saw I was the owner of a real estate portfolio worth millions of dollars. And I, the woman cast out by her own son, had slept on the streets, eaten from trash cans, and begged for scraps of bread. The irony was so cruel, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So I did both. I laughed, then cried, the sounds tangling together like some mad song. People walking by stepped around me, looking on with pity. But I was no longer the woman they thought I was. Or perhaps I had never stopped being myself. It was just that now I finally remembered who I was. I followed the street, searching for a payphone that still worked. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number of attorney Claudine Porter. The phone rang 3 times before a calm, professional voice answered. "Porter and Associates Law Office. How may I assist you?" "I need to speak with attorney Claudine Porter about Harold McRae." My voice was hoarse after weeks of barely speaking. There was a brief hesitation. "Who may I say is calling?" "I'm Lorraine McRae Harold's widow." This time, the pause was longer. "Mrs. McRae, we've been trying to reach you for months. Where have you been? Ms. Porter urgently needs to meet you." I gave them the address of the park. They said they would send a car within 30 minutes. I returned to the bench, clutching the envelope of documents as if it were the only solid thing left in my life. Perhaps it was. A black sedan with tinted windows pulled up at the park entrance. The driver stepped out, face neutral, expertly loaded my 4 suitcases into the trunk, then opened the back door. "Mrs. McRae?" I nodded. Inside, the faint scent of leather and expensive perfume filled the air. I felt grimy, out of place, but I no longer had the strength to care. The glass building in Midtown Atlanta's financial district reflected the blue sky. The elevator took us to the 18th floor in silence. The receptionist looked me up and down, then gently pointed down the hallway. "Ms. Porter is waiting for you." Claudine Porter looked to be around 50, gray hair, neatly styled, thin-rimmed glasses. When I walked in, a flash of surprise crossed her eyes before professionalism settled back in. Mrs. McRae, please have a seat. Would you like water or coffee? Water, please. She poured from a crystal decanter. I took a long drink, like someone who had wandered through a desert. Claudine began, "We've been trying to reach you since Mr. Harold passed away. We left messages at your old home, sent letters. Your son said you'd moved out but didn't provide contact information." My son? The word scraped out, bitter on my tongue. He threw me out 3 weeks ago. I've been living on the streets. Claudine's eyebrows tightened. I'm very sorry. But you need to know, your financial situation is extremely stable. Mr. Harold was a man of great foresight. Have you reviewed all the documents he left for you? I placed the wrinkled envelope on the table. I found it yesterday. I don't understand everything. She skimmed through it quickly, then nodded. These are copies. I have the certified originals. Let me summarize your situation, Mrs. McRae. You currently own 13 properties in the city, valued at approximately $8 million. In addition, there are fund and stock portfolios worth around $2 million. Mr. Harold also left you 3 cash accounts totaling about $500,000. The numbers hung in the air. $10 million. And I, just yesterday, was digging through trash for food. This can't be real, I whispered. It is entirely real, Claudine said softly. And there's more. One of the buildings on Auburn Avenue NE, Suite Auburn, the one where Jalen McRae and his wife, Tasha, live in Unit 301. Yes, I said quietly. According to the records, they've been living under a preferential lease Harold granted 5 years ago, $400 a month for an apartment with a market value of about $2,500. It was a family benefit from Mr. Harold. $400. Jalen lived in a luxury apartment thanks to his father's generosity and still threw his mother onto the street. I stared at the glossy wooden table between us, seeing reflected in it a thin woman with gray hair and a bruise still dark on her temple. Beneath that reflection lay folders detailing assets, shares, cash flows, everything Harold had spent 30 years quietly building for me. In that moment, I understood. I had not walked into this office empty-handed. I walked in with ownership and a voice of my own. I had simply forgotten that voice for far too long. Claudine continued explaining taxes, asset management, audit schedules. I heard her, and yet didn't. In my mind, only one question remained. Can I terminate that preferential lease? I interrupted. Claudine looked up, meeting my eyes. You are the owner, Mrs. McRae. You may do whatever you believe is right, but we must follow legal procedure. We cannot abruptly evict them without notice. I don't want to evict them. Not yet. I heard the coldness in my own voice. It wasn't rage. It was resolve awakening after a long sleep. I want to adjust the rent-to-market value, $2,500 a month, as you said. Claudine nodded slowly. Within your rights, we'll issue a 30-day notice regarding the change in terms. Are you certain you want to proceed? Absolutely certain. I stood up, gripping the empty glass. When I walked out of Porter and Associates, I knew I would return to Auburn Avenue, not as a mother begging at the door, but as the owner of the place, and this was only the beginning. Claudine Porter's fingers flew across the keyboard. Very well. I'll prepare all the paperwork. For now, Mrs. McRae, we need to address more urgent matters. First is your housing. You can move into any vacant property you own, or I'll arrange somewhere temporary for you to rest while you decide. I want to see all the buildings, I said. All of them. I need to know exactly what I own. Of course. We'll start site visits tomorrow. She stood and made a phone call. Within minutes, everything was arranged. A 5-star hotel in Midtown Atlanta, an executive suite. All expenses paid directly from my own account. Before I left the office, Claudine handed me a bank card. This accesses one of your checking accounts. There's $50,000 available for immediate use. Spend whatever you need. And Mrs. McRae, one more thing. She opened a drawer and took out a sealed envelope. Your husband instructed me to give this to you only if you came here in difficult circumstances. I promised him I would. I took the envelope with hands that were no longer quite so shaky. I opened it right there at the desk. A short letter, black ink on thick paper. Harold's second letter. My love, if you're reading this, it means someone has hurt you so badly that you had to seek help. I understand your pride, and I know how hard it is for you to ask for anything. But you must remember, everything I built was for you. Every property, every investment, every saved dollar, each one was meant for the day I am no longer there, and you must protect yourself. Don't let anyone, not even blood, make you feel small. You are a giant, Lorraine. You always have been. Now prove it. Your Harold. Tears spilled over as I read. Claudine tactfully looked away, pretending to review documents. I folded the letter and placed it with the first one. Harold had known. Somehow, he knew there would come a day when I needed this shield. The hotel was everything my life had been missing for so long. Thick, soft carpet, sheets scented with lavender, a marble-tiled bathroom. I stood in the middle of the suite for several minutes, just looking. 24 hours earlier, I'd slept on a park bench. Now I was in a room that cost $300 a night. I filled the tub with hot water and lowered myself in up to my neck. The water turned murky as weeks of grime washed away. I scrubbed my skin until it stung, shampooed my hair 3 times, rinsing away the residue of the streets. I wrapped myself in a white robe so soft it almost made me cry again. I called room service. Soup, freshly baked bread, roast chicken, salad, dessert. When the tray covered in white linen rolled in, I sat down and ate slowly. It wasn't just a meal. It was dignity. It was the right to exist as more than a shadow. That night I slept 12 straight hours. No jolting awake, no cold, no fear. In the morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then everything flooded back. Documents, money, properties, a new reality. Claudine took me to see each property, apartment buildings, commercial spaces, even a small shopping center on the south side. Each one was a piece of the mosaic built over years of Harold's patience and vision. She explained operations, leases, maintenance, cash flow. I took notes like a diligent student. Net monthly income from the whole portfolio is about $45,000, Claudine said during one review. After taxes and maintenance, roughly $400,000 a year without touching principal. $400,000 a year. Only a week ago, I had stood in line for a bowl of soup at a church. The irony was brutal, yet alongside it, a plan began to form. Cold, clear, patient. Claudine, I need a few changes, I told her one afternoon, but discreet ones. No one can know I'm behind them. She leaned back, curiosity in her gaze. What kind of changes? First, the building on Auburn Avenue raised the rent for Unit 301 to market rate as discussed. At the same time, review every lease in the building. If there are discounts or special favors, bring them all up to standard. Everyone is treated the same. That building must operate as a business, not a charity. Understood. What else? I need to change my appearance, buy new clothes, and I want a legal entity to sign all documents, a name with no obvious connection to Lorraine McRae. We'll set up an LLC. You'll be the beneficial owner, behind the scenes, entirely legal and very common. Call it Peachtree Gate Holdings. That evening, I spread the account statements across the table, my fingers trailing over numbers that once would have terrified me. Suddenly, I understood. For 50 years, I'd been confined to the kitchen, the laundry basket, women's work. But my mind had never dulled. It simply had never been used in the right arena. If every detail of my life could be given a price by others, then from this moment on, the one setting the price would be me. Don't look away. The reversal has only just begun. I went to a salon, cut in color, gray covered by an elegant shade of brown. Then to a boutique. The staff took my measurements, choosing clothes that fit well, pearl gray dresses, earth-tone suits, deep green silk blouses, nothing flashy, just refined. New frames for my glasses, neatly manicured nails, a touch of makeup softening deep lines. I didn't turn into someone else. I found the Lorraine buried under years of quiet service. Claudine taught me how to read financial reports, interpret statements, and make decisions. I learned faster than either of us expected. "You have a knack for this," she said. "Mr. Harold chose good investments, and you have an instinct for spotting opportunity." Perhaps that instinct had always been there. It just never had a chance to speak. The notice went out to all tenants at Auburn Avenue, signed by Peachtree Gate Holdings, represented by Porter and Associates. The adjustments stayed within legal limits, but were substantial. Especially for those who had enjoyed special privileges for years, Claudine updated me on the responses. Some angry, some begging to renegotiate. "One unit has called 7 times," she said. "Unit 301, Lorraine McRae. He claims to have a special arrangement with the previous owner, says there must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," I replied calmly. "Tell him that arrangement ended when Mr. Harold McRae passed away. From now on, he pays full price, or he leaves." He insists on speaking directly with the owner. "The owner does not appear. All communication goes through Porter and Associates." In the days that followed, Claudine reported, "Jalen tried to borrow to cover the new rent they've been living beyond their means. Maxed out credit cards, car loans, a high-spending lifestyle. The increase puts them under significant pressure." "Good," I said, my voice detached, not gleeful, simply recognizing a natural consequence. Jalen had married a woman who spent far beyond their capacity, living lavishly off his father's generosity, then tossed his own mother into the street. Now he was paying the price. Tasha worked from home as an independent consultant. I asked Claudine to check. One of her main clients rented a unit at South Commercial Plaza, which also belonged to me. "Suite 203, $2,200 a month," Claudine read from the file. "Good business, solid payment record. Raise it to $3,500. That's a steep increase. They might move out." "Then let them. My assets should reflect their true value." The client didn't move, but they cut costs. One of the first things slashed, consulting contracts, including Tasha's. Claudine mentioned it casually. I simply nodded and turned the page. Inside, there was a quiet sense of balance settling into place. This wasn't revenge yet. It was the scales shifting back. One afternoon, Claudine called. "Jalen has requested a hearing with building management. He's 2 months behind on rent. Under policy, we're entitled to begin eviction proceedings." "How much exactly?" "Altogether about $5,000, with late fees bringing it to $6,200. I could have withdrawn that amount in cash from my purse, but I didn't. "Proceed according to protocol." "Are you sure? The filing will be public and hurt his credit." "I'm completely sure." That night, I didn't sleep, not from guilt, but from a tangled knot of emotions I couldn't quite name. In the bathroom mirror stood a woman with squared shoulders, steady eyes, and a determined jaw. She was not the same woman who had walked into Claudine's office 2 months earlier. She was not begging. She was reclaiming what she was owed. The next day, Claudine reported each step. Notice filed. Jalen had 30 days to pay in full or vacate. He called repeatedly, demanded to meet the owner, asked for extensions, proposed payment plans. I answered exactly as you instructed. The rules apply equally to everyone, no exceptions. Perfect. I hired a private investigator as well, not to meddle, but to understand. The report hurt more than I expected. Jalen's sales manager salary was sufficient for a decent life, but Tasha spent 3 times what they earned, maxed out credit cards, juggling loans to pay other loans, fine dining 5 times a week, designer clothes worn once and forgotten, neighbors reported shouting, doors slamming, heavy silences. A vicious cycle of blame. Tasha accusing Jalen of not earning enough, Jalen accusing Tasha of overspending. I read it twice. Part of me, the mother, wanted to call to help, but the other part, the woman who had just learned to stand tall, knew that would be wrong. Jalen needed to hit bottom to understand consequences. He had let me hit bottom, watched me bleed on the kitchen floor, turned up the TV, threw me out with $200 and an empty promise. He never called to ask if I was even alive. That truth hurt more than any blow. On day 28, Claudine called again. Jalen is paid, not sure from where, but there's a new fast loan on his report. Short term, 32% interest. He bought himself some time. Understood. Keep watching. Update me on any changes. 2 weeks later, the next rent deadline came and passed. Nothing. This time, I didn't wait. Start eviction immediately, no additional warnings. At the same time, I actively began to heal myself. Morning yoga classes, to learn how to breathe and how to be still without it being for someone else. In the evenings, I wrote in a brown leather notebook about Harold, about what we'd never said, about Jalen, about the hard truth that sometimes love isn't enough without boundaries. One afternoon, I was writing on the hotel rooftop. An elderly woman, nearly 80, with neatly combed white hair and sharp blue eyes, sat at the next table. Forgive me, I've seen you here several times, always writing and always alone, she smiled. You remind me of myself a few years ago. I nodded warily. She wasn't selling anything, wasn't preaching. She simply said, after my husband died, I realized I didn't know who I was without him. I had been a wife, a mother, a grandmother, but never just me. So I had to learn that from scratch. Are you learning that too? Something like that, I admitted. The hard part isn't figuring out who you are. She gazed off into the distance. The hard part is allowing yourself to become that person, especially when she isn't who others expect you to be. She touched my shoulder lightly, then left. I never learned her name, never saw her again, but her words anchored themselves deep inside me. She was right. The hard part wasn't discovering who Lorraine was without Harold or Jalen. The hard part was allowing myself to be that woman, a woman who sets boundaries and demands they be respected, a woman who doesn't apologize for existing, a woman who reclaims what has always been hers. The eviction process moved forward steadily. Claudine updated me every other day. Jalen hired a bargain basement attorney who tried to cling to procedural loopholes. The increase was too sudden, procedurally flawed. They needed more time. But Claudine's filings were airtight. Every notice, every deadline, every piece of evidence placed precisely where it needed to be. There was no escape route. The hearing is next Thursday, Claudine said. With this file, the judge will rule in our favor. Jalen will have at most 10 days after the judgment to vacate. I'll be there, I replied. You don't need to appear, Claudine frowned. Maintaining anonymity is safer. I'll just sit in the audience. She nodded. Eviction hearings are public. As long as no one recognized me, I would simply be another face on the wooden benches Thursday morning arrived under a heavy, rain-laden sky. I chose a charcoal suit, an ivory silk blouse, a low bun, and my new glasses. In the mirror stood a woman Jalen would never recognize, no longer the mother hunched over a pot of soup, but someone else entirely, steady, awake. I arrived early and sat on the back row. The hallway smelled of stale paper and cold coffee. Jalen came 15 minutes before the hearing with Tasha and a young, exhausted-looking attorney in a worn suit. My son looked gaunt, with dark circles and messy hair. Tasha, in contrast, was overdressed for a court proceeding, fury tightly pressed beneath foundation and mascara. They sat facing forward, unaware I was behind them. Claudine appeared right on time, black suit, slim briefcase, composed and razor-sharp. Case number 3478, Peachtree Gate Holdings versus Jalen McRae, the clerk announced. The defense attorney spoke first. The rent increase was too aggressive, 5 years of good tenancy, special consideration requested. Even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. Claudine stood and submitted each document: the original lease, the notice of adjustment, the late notices, the payment record. She stated clearly, the previous discount had been a courtesy from the late owner. The new management merely aligned the unit with market standards. Legal and reasonable, Your Honor, she concluded. The defendant has not only failed to meet the new rate, but is 2 months behind. A single payment under eviction pressure, followed by repeated delinquency, indicates a pattern of non-compliance. The judge, a woman around 60, looked up. Mr. Jalen, are you currently 2 months behind under the updated terms? Jalen shifted uncomfortably. Yes, but the increase was too fast. Please, we just need an extension. Just 3 months. You were given the required 30-day notice. The judge cut him off. Do you have the delinquent amount available right now? Silence. He looked at his lawyer, then at Tasha, then lowered his head. No, Your Honor. Then the court rules for the plaintiff. You have 10 days to vacate. After that, forcible removal may proceed. The gavel fell. Everything ended in under 20 minutes. Jalen sat frozen. Tasha shot up, voice shrill. This isn't fair! We have rights! Her lawyer yanked her out before she could earn a contempt charge. They passed by me without ever seeing me. I was still invisible, just another body on a bench. I left through a side door. Claudine waited at a nearby cafe, 2 cups already set out. It went exactly as expected, she said. Yes. How do you feel? Like closing a door, I answered. But I don't know what's on the other side yet. Claudine nodded. You weren't cruel today. You merely allowed consequences to return to their rightful owner. I knew that logically. Emotion arrives slower. Justice isn't a cheer. It's the quiet after the gavel. Revenge asks, what can I do to them? Justice asks, what did they choose? And what is the price of that choice? Don't look away, because in silence, new rules are being written. Claudine slid a folder toward me. A handwritten letter from Martha Gomez, tenant of Unit 105 in the Magnolia Building, a night shift nurse, single mother of 2, perfect payment history. She requested a gradual rent increase, spread over 6 months, with proof of income and recommendation letters from her workplace. What do you think? Claudine asked. I've been in that position, I said slowly. There's a difference between someone who truly tries and someone who dodges responsibility. I'm listening. Approve her proposal 6-month phase-in. If she stays on time afterward, consider keeping her rate below market long-term. Claudine smiled. That's generous. It's not generosity, it's discernment. I'll be firm with those who hurt me and exploited privilege, but I won't blind myself to genuine struggle. I won't become Tasha. I signed the approval. My coffee had gone cold. Outside, the rain began, light but steady, washing the dust off an old chapter. A door had just closed, and this time the key was in my hand. The following days were strung tight like a violin string. Claudine kept updating me on Jalen's desperate attempts to overturn the judgment. He filed an appeal, which only bought him exactly 1 more week. He tried to borrow more money, but his credit history was ruined. He put his furniture, electronics, anything of value up for sale. The appeal was rejected after 3 days. The higher court didn't even require a hearing, just reviewed the file and upheld the original ruling. Jalen now had less than a week to move out. 2 days before the eviction deadline, Claudine received an unexpected call. Jalen, she said when she met me that afternoon. He's asking to speak directly with the owner, says it's important, begging for a meeting. What did you say? I asked. I said I'd relay the message he wants to meet you. The question hung in the air. Did I want to see my son? The mother in me screamed, yes. The clear-headed part of me was wary. What does he want to say? I'm not sure. He only said it was important. I thought for a long minute. Tell Jalen I agree, but not as his mother, as a representative of Peachtree Gate Holdings Neutral Ground, at your office, tomorrow at 3 p.m. You want me present? Claudine asked. No. This time, it has to be just me. That night, I didn't sleep. I rehearsed every line in my head, every reaction. I stood before the mirror practicing how to keep my face calm and flat. Giving nothing away, I had to be steady. Jalen needed to see the businesswoman I had become, not a desperate mother waiting to be loved. At 2 p.m. the next day, I arrived early at the office. Claudine offered me her private room. I sat behind the desk, black leather chair, files spread out in front of me. I wore a charcoal suit, a cream blouse, my hair smoothed back, makeup restrained but resolute. In the reflection, I was no longer the old Lorraine. I looked like Mrs. Mendoza, the legal name I had chosen. Right at 3, I heard voices at the reception desk. The door opened. Jalen walked in, alone. He froze when he saw me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Confusion, then disbelief, then utter shock. "Mom," he whispered, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Sit down, Jalen." My voice was cool and controlled, the voice of an owner, not a mother. He stumbled into the chair, eyes never leaving my face. I don't understand. What are you doing here? Why are you dressed like this? Where have you been all this time?" Lies. The words sliced through the air. I checked. No calls, no messages. After throwing your mother out of your house, you never once reached out. His mouth opened and closed without sound. His eyes reddened. "Tasha said it was better to give you space, that you were angry. That time would—" "Tasha said," I repeated, my voice cold. "Jalen, since when do you let your wife dictate your relationship with your own mother?" "That's not it. It's just, everything was complicated. Money, work. Tasha was stressed, and it was easier to ignore your mother than to stand up to your wife." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. He lowered his head, silence his only admission. Time compressed, heavy and suffocating. At last, he looked up, another question in his eyes. "Mom, why are you in this office? Why did the lawyer let you use this room?" I took a deep breath. It was time. "I'm not borrowing it. Claudine let me use this room because I'm her client. I am Peachtree Gate Holdings. The building you live in, along with 12 others in this city, the investments, the money, all of it belongs to me. Your father left it to me. It has always been mine. And all this time, you've been paying rent to live in your mother's property." The color drained from Jalen's face. "No, Dad never said—" "Why should I have said anything? So you and Tasha could treat me like hired help and still demand special treatment? So you could get more discounts and privileges?" I stood up, letting just enough anger leak through. "Respect is not tied to a bank balance. I am your mother. That should have been enough." Jalen sagged back in his chair, cradling his head, his shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry. I'm a coward. I let Tasha humiliate you. I turned up the TV when she hit you. Just because I was afraid of a fight, because it was easier to sacrifice my mother than risk my marriage." Those were the words I had waited for all this time, but instead of satisfaction, I felt only exhaustion. "And now you're sorry because you found out your mother has money? Because you know she owns the building you live in? Would you be apologizing if you still thought I was just an old woman with nothing?" He looked up, face wet. "I don't know. That's the worst part. I don't recognize the man who did those things, the man who threw his own mother onto the street just to keep his life comfortable." I sat back down, my voice softening. "Your marriage is falling apart, isn't it?" He nodded miserably. "Tasha left 3 days ago. She said she wouldn't live with a loser who can't even pay rent, that everything is my fault. I lost my job 2 weeks ago for being late, for not being able to focus. I'm carrying over $40,000 in debt. My credit is destroyed. In 2 days I'll be homeless. Ironic, isn't it? I put my mother on the street, and now I'm standing at the edge of the same cliff." "That's not irony," I said quietly. "That's karma." He looked at me, eyes swollen and red. "Did you come here to watch me suffer? Is that what you wanted? To see me punished? The question stopped me cold. I had pulled strings, set the board, watched him unravel piece by piece, and now, sitting across from a broken Jalen, did I feel triumphant? No, I said, surprised by my own answer. I wanted justice. I wanted you to understand what it feels like to be abandoned, to be treated as if you have no worth. I wanted you to hit rock bottom so you could build from there. Have I hit rock bottom? He whispered. He thought for a long moment, then nodded. I think I have. No job, no wife, no money, no home, no dignity, and no mother. Those last two words tore through the silence. I let them sit there between us. You know, the worst part wasn't the ladle hitting my head, I said slowly. It wasn't the nights on the street. It wasn't digging through trash for food. The worst part was the sound of that TV turning up, the moment you heard me in pain and chose to do nothing. He broke down sobbing, hands over his face. If I could go back. But you can't, I cut in. We can only decide what to do with the time that's left. Jalen lifted his head, voice raw. So, what happens now? Redemption doesn't arrive in a flood of elaborate apologies. It begins with the first action after the words, I'm sorry. Here, Lorraine's choice would set the tone for the final act. Punish to seal the lid on the past, or force her son to take responsibility while leaving a small door slightly open. 3 months later. I was watering the roses in my new garden, a quiet little house with a south-facing yard, when the phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Mom. Jalen's voice, but different, firmer. I know you might not pick up, but I wanted to try. Where are you? In a small studio, nothing fancy, but it's mine. I pay for it with a night shift warehouse job. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. I'm paying down the debt bit by bit. A tight knot in my chest loosened. I'm glad to hear that. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I want you to know I'm trying. I go to therapy every week. I'm learning how I became that man. Why I let Tasha turn me into someone I don't recognize. Good, Jalen. That's very good. He hesitated. Someday, would you have coffee with me? It doesn't have to be soon. Only when you're ready, if you're ever ready. I looked at the coral and gold roses blooming in front of me, at the wooden porch of the house I'd rebuilt from ashes. Maybe, I said, one day, when we're both ready. I can wait. I've learned how to be patient. His voice wavered. I love you, Mom. I know I don't deserve to say that after everything, but it's still true. I know, I whispered, then hung up. I sat on the porch, teacup in hand, letting the morning sun warm my cheek. I opened my brown leather notebook and wrote, I am learning to forgive myself for waiting so long to defend myself. I am learning that self-love is not selfish. It is survival, dignity, and the foundation for everything else. The wind rustled the leaves. Somewhere near the porch, a bird began to sing, and I, Lorraine McRae, 71 years old, owner of 13 buildings, survivor of betrayal and abandonment, had been reborn from my own ashes, whole free, and finally belonging to myself. If you believe that every wound can become the beginning of a rebirth, then subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Every week, we share the journeys of people who once fell, but rose again stronger than ever. And who knows, one day, your own story might be the one told here.